Chapter 1. The Blood on the Snow. The wind carried the smell of ash and ozone. It was a bitter scent that never left the air. Silas Vance knelt in the gray snow. The knee pads of his canvas pants offered little protection against the frozen earth beneath. His joints ached with the deep, persistent pain of a long winter. He ignored the discomfort. Pain meant he was still alive. He focused his attention on the brass snare wire wrapped around the base of a dead oak tree. The wire was completely slack. The trap held nothing but drifted snow and dead leaves. He let out a slow breath. 3 days had passed without fresh meat. His stomach clamped tight, a dull knot of hunger that he had learned to live with. He pulled the collar of his heavy wool coat higher around his neck. The biting wind found every gap in his clothing. It chilled him to the bone. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were thick and the color of a bruised eye. The sun was nothing more than a pale, yellow smudge behind the toxic haze. It had been that way for 8 long years. The ashfall never truly stopped. It just settled on everything, turning the world into a gray wasteland. Silas began to pack up the wire. He untied the complex knot with stiff fingers. He rolled the brass wire tight and slid it into a worn leather pouch attached to his belt. In this new world, every single resource mattered. A piece of wire could catch a rabbit. It could tie a splint. It could save a life. He stood up slowly and brushed the snow from his knees. He reached down and picked up his rifle. He slung the weapon over his shoulder. The rifle was a Marlin 30-30 lever action. The walnut stock was deeply scarred from years of hard use. The blued steel barrel was worn down to a dull gray finish. It was not a modern military weapon. It had no lasers or advanced optics. It was simple. It was rugged. It was reliable. Most importantly, it had kept him alive when so many others had perished. He turned to the west, preparing to start the long hike back to his hidden camp. He needed to melt snow for drinking water before dark. Then he heard it. It started as a low mechanical hum. The sound vibrated through the soles of his heavy boots before it reached his ears. Silas immediately dropped back to his knees. His survival instincts took over. He scrambled backward through the snow. He pressed his chest and face against the thick trunk of a fallen pine tree. He blended into the gray landscape. The hum grew rapidly into a harsh roar. Engines, 2-stroke motors running on scavenged, low-grade fuel. The abrasive noise tore through the sacred quiet of the dead forest. Silas pulled his rifle from his shoulder. He rested the heavy barrel on the fallen log. He used his thumb to pull the hammer back to the full cocked position. The metallic click sounded incredibly loud in his own ears, but he knew the engine noise would cover it. He slowed his breathing. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. Count to 3. He peered slowly around the rough bark of the pine tree. A solitary figure broke through the tree line 50 yards to his right. It was a woman. She stumbled blindly through the knee-deep snow, her legs kicking up clouds of gray powder. She wore a heavy green winter parka. The durable fabric was torn violently at the left shoulder. Thick, dark blood stained the olive green material, freezing as it soaked into the cloth. She caught her foot on a buried root and fell hard face first into the snow. She let out a sharp cry of pain. She pushed herself up desperately with her right arm. Her left arm hung entirely useless at her side. She cast a terrified glance over her shoulder. Panic widened her eyes. She scrambled back to her feet and continued to run, but her pace was slowing. She was running out of energy. Then her hunters appeared. 3 men on heavily modified dirt bikes burst from the tree line. The machines tore up the frozen ground, spitting dirt and snow into the air. The riders wore mismatched leather jackets reinforced with bolted scrap metal, old street signs, and cut-up tire treads. Silas recognized the crude armor immediately. Rust hounds. They were a vicious gang of marauders who claimed the ruined interstate highways 50 miles to the east. They survived by taking everything from anyone weaker than them. They rarely ventured this far deep into the timber country. Something valuable had drawn them out here. The lead rider skidded his bike to a halt, blocking the woman's path. He kicked the metal stand down into the dirt. He reached to his hip and pulled out a rusted, heavy machete. He pointed the jagged blade directly at the exhausted woman. The other 2 riders circled her like wolves, revving their engines. They laughed. The sound was harsh, cruel, and completely devoid of humanity. It cut straight through the roar of the mechanical engines. Silas lowered his head behind the log. His jaw tightened. This was not his fight. The golden rule of the ashfall was simple. Do not get involved. He had survived all these years by staying hidden. He had survived by turning a blind eye and walking away. Every time he had tried to help someone in the past, it had cost him dearly. He tightened his grip on the smooth wooden stock of the marlin. He told his mind to ignore the woman. He told his body to turn around and crawl silently away into the dense brush. He shifted his weight carefully to begin his retreat. He moved his heavy right boot backward. The heel pressed down hard on a hidden, dry pine branch buried under the fresh snow. The brittle wood snapped violently under his weight. The sound was sharp and sudden. In the freezing thin air, it cracked as loudly as a pistol shot. The cruel laughter stopped instantly. The three rust hounds snapped their heads simultaneously toward the dense trees where Silas was hiding. The lead rider raised a gloved hand in a swift motion. The two circling riders killed their engines. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavier than the winter cold. The leader stared directly at the fallen pine tree. He pointed his machete straight at Silas' position. The other two men immediately drew their weapons from their backs. One man held a short-barrel pump-action, 12-gauge shotgun. The other man gripped a rusty, tape-wrapped submachine gun. They dismounted their bikes and began to walk slowly toward the tree line. They spread out wide to flank the hidden noise. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Silas cursed silently, the words bitter in his mind. He had made a fatal mistake. The choice to walk away was gone. He was in it now. He did not hesitate. He stepped out confidently from behind the cover of the fallen tree. He brought the heavy rifle up to his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. He exhaled a long breath, steadying his hands. He settled the iron front sight post squarely on the center chest of the man carrying the pump-action shotgun. He pulled the trigger smoothly. The rifle bucked aggressively against his shoulder. The explosive blast shattered the morning silence, echoing off the bare trees. The man with the shotgun jerked violently backward as the heavy bullet struck him. He collapsed flat onto his back in the gray snow. A dark crimson stain began to spread rapidly across the front of his jacket. He did not move again. Silas worked the lever action immediately. His hand moved down and forward, then back up. The action cycled smooth and incredibly fast. The empty brass casing spun vertically through the cold air. It landed with a soft hiss, smoking in the snow at his feet. The second man with the submachine gun yelled in rage. He squeezed his trigger tight. Dirt, snow, and bark exploded from the tree trunk, inches from Silas' face. Deadly splinters rained down heavily on his coat. Silas dropped instantly to one knee, making himself a smaller target. He racked the lever again, chambering a fresh round. He aimed low beneath the incoming fire. He fired directly at the man's legs. The high-velocity bullet struck the marauder just above the knee. The rust hound fell to the ground, screaming in agony. His finger clamped down on the trigger in shock, sending wild bursts of automatic fire harmlessly up into the gray sky. Silas cycled the lever a third time without pausing. He turned his sights onto the gang leader. The leader did not run away. He chose to charge. He raised the rusted machete high above his head and sprinted forward. He closed the distance incredibly fast. 30 yards. Silas tracked the running man with the front sight. 20 yards. Silas adjusted his aim to the man's chest. 10 yards. Silas squeezed the trigger firmly. Click. A misfire. The primer in the old scavenge cartridge was completely dead. Silas did not waste time panicking. Panic meant death. He simply let go of the rifle with his right hand, letting it hang by the sling. He reached smoothly down to his thick leather belt. He drew his heavy steel hunting knife from its sheath. The leader lunged forward with a primal scream. The heavy machete swung down in a vicious, deadly arc, aimed straight for the side of Silas' neck. Silas stepped aggressively inside the wide swing. He raised his left arm high to block the man's descending wrist. The heavy metal scrap brace on the hunter's jacket slammed violently into Silas' forearm. A sharp, burning pain shot up to his elbow. Silas ignored the pain entirely. He drove the heavy hunting knife fiercely upward. The sharp steel blade caught the leader deep under the ribs, piercing through the thick leather. Silas pushed forward with all his body weight, driving the man backward. The leader gasped sharply. His aggressive eyes went completely wide with shock. The rusted machete slipped slowly from his loosening fingers. It fell silently into the soft snow. Silas twisted the knife handle sharply. He pulled the blade free in a quick motion. The large man crumpled heavily to the frozen ground. He twitched only once and then lay perfectly still. The dead forest became quiet again. The wind returned, howling through the bare branches. The only other sound was the harsh, wet breathing of the wounded man with the shattered leg. Silas walked slowly over to him. The man groaned and reached desperately for a small pistol tucked into his belt. Silas kicked the man's hand away with brutal force. He raised his heavy, steel-toed boot and brought it down hard on the side of the man's head. The marauder went completely limp. Silas stood alone among the three bodies. His breath plumed in thick white clouds in the freezing air. His heart hammered rhythmically against his ribs, pumping adrenaline through his veins. He looked down at his knife. He wiped the bloody steel blade clean on the dead leader's leather jacket. He returned the knife safely to its leather sheath. He picked up his hanging rifle. He worked the lever to eject the bad, unspent cartridge. It tumbled harmlessly into the snow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of ammunition. He fed 3 fresh brass rounds through the loading gate on the side of the metal receiver. The cold brass bit into his bare, freezing fingers. He topped off the magazine tube entirely, ensuring the weapon was ready for another fight. He began to search the bodies immediately. He moved with practiced, efficient speed. He checked every single pocket and pouch. He found 2 spare 12-gauge shotgun shells. He found a half-eaten, stale protein bar wrapped in plastic. He found a crushed, dirty pack containing 3 old cigarettes. He took all of it without hesitation. Out here, every single item was a valuable currency. Every calorie, every round of ammunition bought exactly 1 more day of difficult life. Then he finally remembered the woman. He turned slowly and looked back toward the open clearing. She was still there. She had managed to drag herself back over to the rusted metal frame of an old, abandoned pickup truck. She was watching his every move intensely. Silas slung his loaded rifle back over his right shoulder. He began to walk methodically toward her. His heavy boots crunched loudly on the crusted, icy snow. As he got closer to the truck, he clearly saw the severe extent of her injuries. Her face was incredibly pale, drained of all color. Black dirt and gray ash heavily smeared her sharp cheeks. The thick green parka was soaked heavy with dark, freezing blood. Her left arm hung at a strange, unnatural angle. As the wind blew the torn fabric back, Silas realized it was not a normal human arm. From just below the elbow down to the fingertips, the limb was constructed entirely of matte black metal, exposed copper wires, and carbon fiber joints. It was an advanced prosthetic arm. It looked like technology from before the asphalt, maybe even better. Silas had never seen anything like it in his entire life. She looked very young, maybe 24 or 25 years old at most. She looked completely out of place in this brutal, ash-covered wasteland. Her skin, where it was not covered in dirt, was entirely too clean and smooth. Her messy hair was a bright, vibrant auburn color. It completely lacked the dull, unwashed gray appearance that absolutely everyone else on the surface had. Silas stopped exactly 10 feet away from her. He did not speak a single word. He stood still and simply watched her hands. She was breathing very hard. Every single breath seemed to cause her sharp physical pain. She slid slowly down the rusted side of the old truck. She hit the frozen ground with a soft thud. She pulled her knees up tight to her chest, shivering violently from the cold and the shock of blood loss. Silas let out a quiet sigh. He took one more step forward. He reached slowly into his inner coat pocket to offer her a clean cloth bandage. Her right hand moved in a sudden, desperate flash of speed. She pulled a small, black, semi-automatic pistol from her deep coat pocket. She raised the weapon with a badly trembling hand. She pointed the cold steel barrel directly at the center of his chest. Silas froze completely still. He looked down at the gun. It was a compact 9mm handgun. His experienced eyes noticed the details immediately. The slide of the pistol was locked back firmly in the rear position. The firing chamber was completely open and empty. The magazine was dry. She had fired all her available rounds before she ever reached the tree line. He looked up from the empty weapon directly into her eyes. Her eyes were bright blue and fiercely, stubbornly determined. She absolutely knew the gun was empty. She knew that he knew it was empty, but she held the weapon steady, aimed at him anyway. It was an act of pure, desperate defiance. She swallowed hard, fighting through the pain. Her voice was cracked, raspy, and terribly dry from the freezing wind. "Take me to these coordinates," she said clearly. She reached carefully into her front pocket with 2 trembling fingers. She pulled out a small, crumpled piece of yellow paper. She tossed it onto the snow in the space exactly between them. "Take me there," she repeated, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, "and I will give you enough food to last a lifetime." Chapter 2. The Eden Drive. Silas stepped forward and took the empty 9mm pistol from her trembling hand. Her fingers were stiff and blue from the freezing cold. She did not resist. He dropped the heavy magazine into his leather glove. He checked the open chamber out of habit. Completely dry. He tucked the empty weapon into his belt. He bent down and picked up the crumpled yellow paper from the snow. He unfolded it carefully. It listed a specific set of geographic coordinates: latitude and longitude. The location was deep in the western mountains. It was a place where the winter storms always hit the hardest. He folded the paper and pushed it deep into his coat pocket. He looked down at her. She was leaning heavily against the rusted truck tire. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. "Can you walk?" He did not ask it as a question. It was a direct demand. She swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "Then get up. Gunfire travels far in this thin air. The rest of their pack will come looking for them." Silas led her 2 miles north away from the dead men. He walked over rough, rocky ground to hide their footprints. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a lone predator. Harper struggled to keep up. Her heavy boots dragged in the deep snow. She breathed loudly. Every step she took seemed to snap a dry twig or kick a loose rock. Silas stopped 3 different times to let her rest. He did not say a single word. He just watched the dark tree line with cold eyes. They reached an abandoned gas station just as the gray sky began to darken into night. The old building sat alone on a cracked asphalt road. The metal fuel pumps were rusted completely hollow. The large front windows were boarded up with rotted plywood. Silas kicked the side door open. He swept the dark interior with the heavy barrel of his rifle. The room was empty. It smelled heavily of damp concrete, rat droppings, and decades of old dust. Old metal shelving units lay overturned on the filthy floor. He moved to a corner away from the broken windows. He pulled a small metal trash can from under a ruined counter. He reached into his pack and brought out a handful of dry wood chips and a small piece of fat wood. He struck a ferrocerium rod with the back of his steel knife. A shower of bright sparks hit the resin-soaked wood. A small flame caught immediately. The fire crackled and popped. The small blaze cast dancing orange shadows against the dirty walls. The heat was weak, but it felt like a miracle in the freezing room. "Sit down by the fire," Silas ordered. Harper slid down the cold concrete wall and sat near the metal can. She held her injured left arm tight against her chest. "Take off the coat." She hesitated. "It is too cold. Take it off, or you will lose the arm to infection by tomorrow morning. Your choice." She bit her bottom lip and slowly unzipped the heavy green parka. She let it slide off her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a simple gray wool sweater. The left sleeve was completely soaked with dark blood. Silas knelt beside her. He pulled a small canvas medical kit from his pack. He took out a pair of heavy trauma shears. He cut the bloody wool sleeve right up to the shoulder. He pulled the fabric away to inspect the wound. The heavy bullet had grazed the outside of her shoulder. It had torn deeply through the muscle but missed the bone entirely. It was ugly and bleeding heavily, but it was not fatal. "This will burn," Silas said flatly. He uncapped a small plastic bottle of iodine. He poured the dark brown liquid directly onto the open wound. Harper arched her back. She squeezed her eyes shut tight. A sharp hiss escaped her teeth, but she did not scream. She handled the severe pain much better than he expected. Silas pressed a thick square of white gauze firmly against the wound. He wrapped a tight roll of medical tape around her shoulder to hold it in place. He sat back on his heels and looked at her left arm. Now that the coat and sweater were gone, the artificial limb was completely visible. The shoulder joint was human flesh, scarred heavily where it met metal. From the bicep down to the fingertips, the arm was a complex machine. It was built from matte black carbon fiber, polished steel pistons, and thick bundles of copper wire. The hand looked incredibly delicate but strong. It was an impossible piece of technology in a dead world. "Who built that?" he asked quietly. Harper opened her eyes. She looked down at the metal hand. She flexed the fingers. Tiny electric servos whined softly in the quiet room. "My father," she said. Her voice was steady now. The fire was bringing color back to her pale face. "He was a robotics engineer before the ashfall. We lived in a secure bunker underground, a private shelter. We had power and supplies. But the air filtration systems failed last week. The air turned toxic. Everyone died. I was the only one who got to the surface airlock in time." Silas remained completely silent. He stared at the orange flames. He did not care about her tragic past. He only cared about the yellow paper in his pocket. The coordinates, Silas said. What is there? Harper took a deep breath. It is called the Vault of Eden. It was a classified government project built before the grid went down. It was designed to be a fully self-sustaining sanctuary. Geothermal power, hydroponic farms, clean filtered water. It was meant to hold the best scientists and engineers to rebuild the world. Why are you going there? She reached over with her right hand. She pressed her thumb against a smooth black panel on her artificial left forearm. A tiny green light blinked twice. A mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. A small rectangular metal drive slid out from a hidden compartment inside the metal arm. This is the Eden Drive, she explained. My father helped design the master security protocols for the sanctuary. This drive contains the primary access codes, but it is biometrically locked to me. It needs my blood and my pulse to work. They cannot open the main vault doors without me, and I cannot get there without you. Silas looked at the glowing small metal drive. He looked back at his own worn boots. His boots were held together by gray duct tape and dirty snare wire. He thought about his empty hunting traps. He thought about the 3 cans of beans left in his hidden camp. The winter was going to last at least 4 more months. He was going to starve to death out here. If I get you there, Silas said slowly, you guarantee me entry. You guarantee me a place inside. I swear it, she said firmly. I will not open the doors unless they let you in. Silas stared deep into her bright blue eyes. He looked for a lie. He found nothing but raw desperation. She was telling the truth. She needed him to survive the wasteland. Fine, Silas said. He closed his medical kit and shoved it back into his pack. We have a deal, but we do it my way. What does that mean? It means you do exactly what I tell you to do, without question. You walk when I walk. You hide when I hide. If I tell you to run, you run until your lungs bleed. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make noise. If you slow me down, or if you draw attention to us, I will leave you behind to die in the snow. Harper stared at him. The harsh reality of his words hung heavy in the warm air. She nodded once. Understood. They left the gas station an hour before dawn. The temperature had dropped well below zero. The wind had died down completely, leaving a heavy, dead silence over the ruined world. Silas led the way. He moved through the dense, snow-covered pine trees like a ghost. His boots found the solid ground beneath the snow perfectly. He barely made a sound. Harper walked 10 paces behind him. It was a disaster. She was highly intelligent, but she knew absolutely nothing about moving in the wild. She stepped on dry branches that snapped loudly in the quiet morning. She slipped on hidden ice and fell to her knees. Her heavy breathing sounded like a broken engine. Silas stopped constantly to look back at her in silent frustration. He noticed the bright orange lining of her green parka. Every time she moved, the bright color flashed like a beacon against the gray ash. He stopped abruptly and walked back to her. He pulled a sharp knife from his belt. Before she could react, he grabbed the front of her coat. He sliced the bright orange fabric clean out of the inner lining. He threw the colored cloth into the dirt. You are a walking target, he whispered harshly. Keep your head down. She glared at him but said nothing. She zipped the coat back up tight. They walked for 5 brutal hours. The terrain shifted from flat dead forest to steep rocky hills. The snow was much deeper here. Every step required massive physical effort. Harper was completely exhausted. Her face was gray and covered in cold sweat. Her injured shoulder throbbed with every single heartbeat. But she did not complain. She kept walking. Silas respected her stubbornness, even if he hated her noise. By midday, they reached the top of a high, rocky ridge. Silas held up a closed fist. The universal signal to stop. Harper collapsed against a frozen boulder, gasping for thin air. Silas moved slowly to the edge of the cliff. He lay flat on his stomach in the snow. He pulled a pair of heavy military field glasses from his pack. He pressed the cold rubber cups to his eyes and scanned the valley below them. He looked back the exact way they had come. 10 miles away, near the edge of the dead forest, he saw it. A thick column of black, oily smoke rising straight up into the gray sky. It was a signal fire. He adjusted the focus wheel on the field glasses. He looked closer to the source of the smoke. Tiny black shapes were moving rapidly across the white snow. Vehicles, a lot of them. They had found the 3 dead bodies. Silas swept the lenses slightly to the left. His heart skipped a beat. Leading the pack of dirt bikes was a massive 6-wheeled transport truck. The vehicle was completely covered in thick steel armor plating. A heavy machine gun was mounted on the roof. The truck was plowing right through the snow and dead trees, following their exact path. The Rust Hounds were not just a small patrol. It was the entire gang, and they were coming fast. Silas lowered the glasses. He turned his head and looked at Harper. She was resting her head against the rock with her eyes closed. She had absolutely no idea that death was rushing toward them at 40 miles per hour. Chapter 3. Howls in the Ash. Silas dropped the heavy field glasses into the snow. He grabbed Harper by the right shoulder and hauled her roughly to her feet. "Move," he commanded, "down the backside of the ridge, right now." Harper did not ask any questions. She saw the cold urgency in his gray eyes. She turned and scrambled down the steep, snowy incline. Loose rocks and sharp ice slid dangerously beneath her heavy boots. She slipped and fell hard onto her side, scraping her knee against a jagged stone. She ignored the sharp pain and forced herself back up. Silas stayed right behind her. He dragged a large pine branch over the snow to ruin their tracks as they descended. At the bottom of the dark ravine, hidden beneath a thick pile of dead timber and a gray canvas tarp, sat a heavily modified four-wheel drive truck. The vehicle was a patchwork of rusted metal, bolted steel plates, and crude welding. Silas threw the heavy canvas tarp aside. He opened the passenger door and shoved Harper inside. He ran to the front, popped the rusted hood, and quickly attached a loose battery cable. Sparks flew in the freezing air. He slammed the hood down and jumped into the driver's seat. He twisted the ignition key. The old diesel engine groaned lazily. It choked on the freezing mountain air. Silas pumped the gas pedal 3 times. The engine finally caught with a violent, shaking shudder. It spit a thick cloud of black exhaust out of the side pipe. He slammed the transmission into gear. The heavy tires spun wildly in the deep snow before their chains found traction on the frozen dirt. They burst out of the hidden ravine and hit the cracked asphalt of the old interstate highway. Silas pushed the gas pedal straight to the metal floor. The truck roared forward, rattling over deep potholes and shattered concrete. "Hold on," Silas shouted over the deafening engine noise. Harper grabbed the heavy handle on the dashboard. She looked in the side mirror. Her blood ran entirely cold. Topping the ridge behind them was a massive 6-wheeled military transport truck. The machine was painted in dull black and covered in thick steel spikes. A heavy machine gun was mounted directly on the roof. Swarming around the massive truck were 6 dirt bikes. The Rust Hounds had found them. The chase tore down the ruined highway. The wind howled through the broken windows of Silas' truck. The temperature inside the cab was absolutely freezing. A heavy, booming voice suddenly echoed across the dead valley. It came from a powerful megaphone mounted on the transport truck. "I want the girl alive. Gut the hunter." It was Grit Caldwell. Even through the distorted speakers, his voice sounded like grinding metal and raw malice. The dirt bikes accelerated. They were much faster than the heavy truck. 2 riders pulled up close to the rear bumper. They raised their weapons. Automatic gunfire erupted. Bullets slammed aggressively into the back of the truck. The heavy steel armor plates deflected most of the rounds, but one bullet shattered the rear glass. Shards of sharp glass rained down on Silas and Harper. Silas cursed loudly. He swerved the steering wheel hard to the left. The truck slammed sideways into a rusted, abandoned sedan on the road. The violent impact sent the sedan spinning directly into the path of the closest dirt bike. The rider had no time to react. He crashed violently into the sedan and flew over the handlebars. His body hit the frozen concrete with a sickening crunch. "Keep your head down," Silas yelled. He grabbed his lever-action rifle from the seat. He drove with his left hand and rested the heavy barrel of the rifle on his right shoulder, pointing blindly out the broken rear window. He fired 2 quick shots. The deafening blasts filled the small cabin with thick, gray smoke and the sharp smell of burnt gunpowder. He did not hit anything, but the remaining riders backed away to a safer distance. Then, the heavy machine gun on the transport truck opened fire. The massive .50 caliber rounds tore the highway apart. The heavy bullets punched cleanly through the thick metal of Silas' truck. One round shattered the passenger side mirror. Another round ripped through the dashboard, sending a shower of plastic shrapnel into the air. Suddenly, a loud metallic screech echoed from under the hood. The engine lost all power instantly. Black smoke poured out from the front grille. A lucky bullet had completely destroyed the engine block. "Brace!" Silas screamed. He slammed on the brakes. The heavy truck went into a violent, uncontrolled spin across the icy highway. The tires shrieked against the concrete. They crashed heavily backward through a rusted chain-link fence. The dead vehicle came to a sudden, bone-jarring halt in the muddy yard of a massive abandoned industrial complex. "Out," Silas ordered. He kicked his jammed door open. Harper stumbled out of the passenger side. Her injured shoulder burned with intense, screaming pain. They sprinted toward the open loading dock of the dark factory. The building was a maze of rusted steel catwalks, massive concrete vats, and broken machinery. It used to be a chemical processing plant. The air inside smelled of ancient dust and toxic residue. They took cover behind a massive, empty steel tank. Seconds later, the rust hounds arrived. The heavy transport truck smashed through the remaining fence. 5 men dismounted quickly. Leading them was Grit Caldwell. Grit was a terrifying giant of a man. He stood over 6 feet and 6 inches tall. He wore crude, makeshift power armor. Heavy steel plates were bolted to his thick leather coat. Pneumatic pistons, scavenged from heavy construction machinery, were attached to his arms and legs to increase his physical strength. He carried a massive steel sledgehammer in his right hand. "Spread out," Grit roared. His voice echoed deeply through the dark factory. "Block the exits. They are trapped." Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. The hunters were moving slowly, sweeping the dark corners with flashlights mounted to their gun barrels. Silas checked his rifle. He had 4 rounds left in the tube. He looked at Harper. She was incredibly pale. She was pressing her right hand hard against her bleeding shoulder. "Stay behind me," Silas whispered quietly. "When the shooting starts, you run for the back stairs. Find a way out." Harper shook her head. She looked around the dark room. Her bright blue eyes quickly scanned the faded warning labels on the metal storage barrels scattered near them. "No," she whispered back. "We cannot outrun them. We have to blind them." She crawled quietly toward a stack of heavy white plastic buckets. The faded yellow labels read calcium hypochlorite. It was highly concentrated industrial pool shock used for water treatment. She turned to Silas. "Do you have any brake fluid or engine oil? Anything highly combustible?" Silas stared at her for a split second. He reached into his canvas drop pouch. He pulled out a small plastic bottle of brake fluid he carried for the truck. He handed it to her without a word. Harper moved fast. She found a heavy glass jar sitting on an old workbench. She used her strong metal prosthetic hand to easily crush the plastic lid off one of the white buckets. She scooped a massive pile of the dry white chemical powder into the glass jar. "What is that?" Silas asked softly. "Basic chemistry," Harper answered. Her breathing was fast. "When I mix the fluid with this powder, it creates an extreme exothermic reaction. It will burn violently and release a massive cloud of toxic chlorine gas. You need to throw it hard, right into the center of the room. Do not breathe the smoke." Heavy boots crunched on glass right on the other side of their steel tank. They were completely out of time. Harper unscrewed the cap of the brake fluid. She poured the thick liquid directly into the white powder. She shoved the glass jar into Silas' hands. 3 seconds, she whispered urgently. "Throw it now." The mixture inside the jar immediately began to hiss. The glass became dangerously hot against Silas' leather gloves. He stood up fast from behind the steel tank. He saw Grit Caldwell 10 yards away, raising his massive hammer. Silas threw the jar with all his strength. The glass shattered loudly against a concrete pillar right at Grit's feet. For one brief second, nothing happened. Then the chemicals reacted. A violent, blinding flash of white fire erupted in the dark factory. A concussive wave of heat hit Silas in the face. A massive, expanding cloud of thick, white chlorine gas instantly filled the entire loading dock. The rust hounds began to scream. The toxic smoke burned their eyes and seared their lungs. Men dropped their weapons and clawed desperately at their own throats, choking on the caustic air. Grit Caldwell roared in pure rage and pain. He swung his heavy hammer blindly through the thick smoke, hitting nothing but empty air. "Go," Silas yelled. He grabbed Harper by the arm, and they sprinted toward the back stairs. They ran up the rusted metal steps, moving higher into the factory above the toxic smoke. Silas stopped at the landing. He raised his rifle, aiming down into the swirling white cloud. He saw the faint outline of a guard blocking the exit door. Silas fired once. The man dropped silently. They pushed through the heavy metal exit doors and ran out into the freezing night air. They did not stop running. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. They scrambled up a steep, rocky canyon wall, leaving the sounds of coughing and screaming far behind them in the dark valley. 2 hours later, the snow began to fall heavily again, covering their tracks entirely. They reached a dead end in the narrow canyon. A massive wall of solid gray rock blocked their path. Silas leaned against the cold stone, gasping for air. He looked at Harper. She was exhausted, bleeding, and shivering violently. But she had saved both of their lives. He nodded at her slowly. It was a silent gesture of deep respect. "We are here," Harper said quietly. Her voice was weak. She walked toward the solid rock face. She brushed away a thick layer of snow and frozen vines. Beneath the dead vegetation was a perfectly smooth panel of dark black metal. She raised her mechanical left arm. A small compartment opened on her forearm. The Eden drive slid out, glowing with a soft green light. She pressed the drive directly into a hidden slot on the metal panel. The mountain trembled. A deep mechanical grinding noise echoed from deep inside the earth. The solid rock face split down the middle. Two massive steel blast doors, each weighing several tons, slowly hissed open. Warm, clean air spilled out into the freezing night. Bright, artificial yellow light blinded them. Silas raised his rifle defensively. They stepped cautiously through the massive doorway into a clean, white corridor. The heavy steel doors immediately hissed shut behind them. The locking mechanism slammed violently into place. They were sealed inside. "Welcome home, Miss Delaney," a smooth, calm male voice echoed from the ceiling speakers. Silas blinked against the bright light. Standing at the end of the long corridor were 10 men dressed in pristine black tactical gear. They held modern, silenced assault rifles. Every single laser sight was pointed directly at the center of Silas' chest. Stepping through the armed guards was a man in an immaculate, pre-war gray suit. His shoes were perfectly polished. Not a single speck of ash touched his clothing. Garrison Locke smiled warmly. "We have been waiting for you, Harper," Locke said gently. He looked at Silas with cold, dead eyes. "Take the drive from her arm and execute the scavenger." Chapter 4. The Golden Cage. 10 red laser dots rested directly on the center of Silas' chest. He did not blink. His right hand tightened on the wooden grip of his rifle, but he knew the brutal math of the situation. 10 modern assault rifles against one old lever action. He might kill one guard before the others tore his body apart. He lowered the heavy steel barrel slowly toward the polished floor. Harper stepped directly in front of him. She intentionally blocked the red laser sights with her own body. "No," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she spoke loud enough to echo in the corridor. "Call them off, Garrison." Garrison Locke tilted his head. He looked mildly amused. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Not a single speck of gray ash touched his clothing. He looked entirely alien in this dead world. "He is a surface scavenger, Harper," Locke said smoothly. "A carrier of disease, radiation, and violence. He has served his purpose. He brought you home to us." "He saved my life," Harper countered fiercely. She raised her mechanical left arm. Her thumb hovered dangerously over the glowing green slot where the Eden drive rested. "If you order them to shoot him, I will format this drive right now. I will wipe every single security protocol my father wrote. You will never access the terraforming data." Locke stopped smiling. The coldness in his pale eyes deepened. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive gray suit. He calculated the risk in a fraction of a second. "Lower your weapons," Locke ordered softly. The 10 guards dropped their rifles in perfect unison. Locke gestured gracefully down the long, immaculate corridor. "Please, come inside. You both must be freezing." Silas handed his rifle and his steel hunting knife to a guard. He had no other choice. They walked forward. The heavy steel blast doors hissed shut behind them. The locking mechanisms slammed violently into place. The wasteland was completely gone. The immediate change in the atmosphere was staggering. For 8 long years, Silas had heard nothing but the howling winter wind and the crunch of dead, frozen earth. Out there, the world was a frozen graveyard. Here, the air was perfectly still and wonderfully warm. A massive industrial ventilation system hummed a low, constant rhythm above them. It was a deep, soothing sound. Faint music drifted gently through hidden ceiling speakers. It was a classical piano piece, slow, methodical, and painfully civilized. Then the smell hit him. It hit his senses harder than a physical blow to the jaw. It was the rich smell of damp earth. Green leaves, blooming flowers. Silas stopped walking. His brain simply could not process the scent. He looked through a massive pane of reinforced glass on his right side. Beyond the thick glass was an enormous hydroponic garden. Rows of bright green vegetables grew under intense artificial sunlight. Clean, clear water trickled through complex plastic irrigation tubes. Tomato vines climbed tall wooden trellises. It was impossible. It was a completely different planet. Impressive, is it not? Locke said quietly. He noticed Silas staring at the dirt. We have successfully rebuilt the old world down here. We have clean water. We have fresh, uncontaminated food. We have secure, impenetrable borders. A perfect society requires perfect control. Locke turned his attention back to Harper. Your father built the foundation for this sanctuary, but we need your drive to activate the deep geothermal vents. We need much more power to expand the gardens and sustain our population. I want hot food for him, Harper demanded. She pointed at Silas. And a safe room. That was the deal we made. Of course, Locke agreed easily. His voice was calm and reassuring. My men will take him to the guest quarters immediately. You and I need to go up to the primary control room. Two guards grabbed Harper by the arms. They pulled her gently but firmly toward a glass elevator at the far end of the hall. She looked back at Silas over her shoulder. He gave her a very slight, almost invisible nod. They had made it inside the mountain. Now they just had to survive it. 4 heavy guards surrounded Silas. They did not take him toward the clean, white living quarters. They marched him aggressively down a separate, dark, concrete hallway. The classical music faded away entirely. The air grew noticeably warmer and significantly heavier. They pushed him into a large, rusted industrial freight elevator. The metal cage rattled violently as it began a rapid descent deep into the earth. The temperature rose sharply with every passing second. Silas began to sweat under his heavy wool coat. He stripped the coat off and dropped it onto the dirty metal floor. The air inside the shaft smelled of sulfur, burning oil, and old sweat. The elevator came to a grinding, screeching halt. The metal grate slid open automatically. The guards shoved Silas forward. He stumbled out onto a rusted iron catwalk. He looked down over the metal railing. He was standing near the top of a massive, hollowed-out underground cavern. At the very bottom, hundreds of feet below the catwalk, sat a massive nuclear reactor. It glowed with a sickening, heavy blue light. A chaotic maze of rusted pipes, pressure gauges, and high-pressure steam valves surrounded the glowing core. But it was not the massive machine that caught his immediate attention. It was the people. Hundreds of people swarmed around the base of the hot reactor. They were covered in dark soot, thick oil, and grease. They wore ragged, filthy clothes that hung off their starving frames. They carried heavy steel tools, turning massive valves purely by hand. Men and women hauled heavy iron carts of raw materials across the cracked concrete floor. They moved sluggishly, entirely broken by extreme physical exhaustion. Armed guards in protective yellow hazard suits stood on elevated steel platforms above the workers, watching their every single move with rifles ready. This was not a sanctuary. It was a brutal slave camp. Garrison Locke had built his perfect, civilized society directly on the broken backs of the surface survivors. He lured them in with the false promise of safety and warmth. Then he threw them down into this radioactive pit to maintain the failing machines that powered his luxury living quarters above. A guard grabbed Silas aggressively by the back of his shirt. He dragged him down a steep flight of narrow metal stairs. They reached the main floor of the reactor level. The heat down here was absolutely suffocating. It felt exactly like standing directly in front of an open furnace door. The noise was absolutely deafening. Massive steel pistons slammed up and down. High-pressure steam hissed loudly from dozens of leaking pipes. The guard pushed Silas hard against a damp brick wall. Another guard stepped forward, holding a heavy iron collar. It had a blinking red light on the side of the thick metal band. Before Silas could react or fight back, the guard snapped the cold metal ring tightly around his neck. It locked with a sharp, permanent click. You step past the yellow-painted line. The collar detonates and takes your head off. The guard shouted loudly over the roar of the massive machines. You stop working for more than 5 minutes. The collar shocks you until your heart stops. You fight back, we shoot you. Pick up a wrench and get to work. The guards turned around and walked away, disappearing back up the metal stairs into the cool air above. Silas stood entirely still. He touched the cold metal collar locked around his throat. He looked around the massive, hellish cavern. People were actively dying down here. He saw an old man collapse near a massive steam vent. Nobody stopped to help him. The armed guards simply shouted at 2 other workers to drag the dead body away into a dark corner. Silas walked slowly toward a massive iron pipe. He picked up a heavy, grease-covered wrench from the dirty floor. His hands gripped the cold metal tightly. He closed his eyes and regulated his breathing. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. He had survived the freezing winter cold. He had survived the violent marauders on the road. He would survive this fire. He needed to find a way back up to the surface levels. He needed to find Harper before Locke realized she could not actually format the drive without an external terminal. She had bluffed to save his life in the hallway. When Locke finally found out she was lying, he would kill her instantly. "You do not look like a mechanic." The voice came from directly behind him. It was a woman's voice, raspy, tired, and thick, with a heavy blue-collar accent. Silas turned around slowly. Standing a few feet away was a short, stocky woman. Her face was smeared thick with dark grease and dirt. She wore a pair of heavy, stained canvas overalls. She held a thick bundle of heavy copper wire in her left hand. Silas immediately noticed her right hand. The ring finger and the pinky finger were completely missing, severed clean right at the knuckle. She looked at him with sharp, highly calculating green eyes. "I am not a mechanic," Silas answered flatly. "Good," the woman said. She spit a dark glob of chewing tobacco onto the hot concrete floor. It sizzled and evaporated instantly in the extreme heat. "We have more than enough mechanics down here. What we desperately need is someone who knows how to kill." Silas tightened his grip on the heavy steel wrench. He did not say a word. He just waited for her to explain. "My name is Maeve," she said quietly. She stepped much closer to him. The deafening roar of the reactor effectively covered her words from the guards standing on the platforms above. "Locke brings the surface trash down here to die. We fix his broken pipes. We breathe his leaking radiation. We freeze to death on the surface, or we burn to death in this hole." She pointed her missing fingers toward a massive steel grate near the dark back wall of the cavern. It was heavily chained shut and guarded by two men with pump-action shotguns. "That grate leads to the primary ventilation shaft," Maeve whispered urgently. "It goes straight up to the residential levels where Locke lives. I have spent 6 months secretly cutting the bolts on the inside of that grate. We are completely ready to blow it open tonight. But we need a major distraction. We need a bloodbath to pull the guards away from the door." Silas looked at the heavily guarded grate. He looked up at the pristine white ceiling far above them. Harper was up there, trapped in a room with a highly intelligent psychopath. He looked back at Maeve. "How many guards total?" Silas asked. His voice was completely cold and analytical. Maeve smiled grimly. 40 men, fully armed. Heavy body armor. They have superior firepower, secure communications, and the high ground." Silas nodded slowly. The odds were terrible. It was a complete suicide mission. "I need a weapon," Silas said. Maeve reached deep into the front pocket of her canvas overalls. She pulled out a heavy, dark piece of metal wrapped tightly in a dirty, oil-soaked rag. She pressed it firmly into his hand. "I built this from spare reactor parts and scrap steel," she whispered. "It only holds one single shot. Make it count." Silas unwrapped the dirty rag. It was a crude, heavy zip gun. It was just a piece of thick steel pipe welded to a handmade, spring-loaded trigger mechanism. It was loaded with a single 12-gauge shotgun shell. It was dangerous and highly unreliable. Before he could inspect the crude weapon further, a loud, piercing siren suddenly cut through the heavy noise of the cavern. The heavy metal blast doors at the very top of the catwalk opened with a massive crash. Garrison Locke stepped out onto the edge of the high platform. He was holding a microphone. His voice boomed loud and crystal clear through the massive industrial speakers mounted on the cavern walls. "Attention workers," Locke announced calmly, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "We have a slight change of plans. Execute the new arrival immediately." Chapter 5. Shadows and Sparks. The speakers clicked off. Locke had given the order. The massive reactor cavern descended into immediate chaos. Two armed guards in heavy yellow hazard suits were already walking quickly across the cracked concrete floor. They raised their rifles. The weapons were modern AR-15 carbines. The black steel looked completely out of place in the dirty, rusted environment of the lower level. Silas did not wait for them to aim. He raised the crude steel zip gun Maeve had given him. He pointed the heavy metal pipe directly at the chest of the closest guard. He pulled the spring-loaded trigger mechanism back with his thumb and let it snap forward. The firing pin struck the primer of the 12-gauge shotgun shell. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the open steel pipe. The heavy recoil nearly tore the crude weapon out of his hands. A solid slug of lead slammed into the center mass of the first guard. The kinetic energy lifted the man completely off his feet and threw him backward into a pile of rusted metal gears. The zip gun was empty. It was now just a piece of useless pipe. Silas dropped it on the floor. The second guard raised his rifle to fire. Maeve moved with incredible speed for her size. She grabbed Silas by the shoulder of his shirt. She pulled him hard to the right, dragging him behind the massive steel base of a high-pressure steam pipe. A tight 3-round burst of 5.56mm ammunition shattered the concrete wall exactly where Silas had been standing a second before. Sharp fragments of stone sprayed across his face. The red light on the heavy iron collar around Silas' neck began to blink rapidly. It emitted a high-pitched, shrill warning tone. He had stepped completely over the yellow-painted line on the floor. The proximity sensor was tripped. He had exactly 10 seconds before the explosive charge in the collar detonated and severed his head from his shoulders. Silas clawed desperately at the heavy iron band. It was locked tight, solid steel. There was no keyhole. There was no release latch. 9 seconds. Up in the pristine white laboratories of the upper levels, Harper sat alone in a sterile, freezing room. She was sitting in a high-back leather chair in front of a massive computer terminal. 4 armed guards stood silently in the hallway outside her locked door. Garrison Locke had demanded she prepare the Eden drive for data extraction. He had given her exactly 1 hour to complete the task before he returned. Harper rolled up the sleeve of her gray wool sweater. She exposed the matte black carbon fiber of her prosthetic left arm. She pressed a small sequence on her forearm panel. A thin, flexible data cable extruded from her mechanical wrist. She plugged the metal connector directly into the main data port of the computer terminal. Her bright blue eyes scanned the glowing green text, scrolling rapidly across the black screen. She was bypassing the visual user interface completely. She was reading the raw code of the Sanctuary mainframe. Her father had taught her how to speak the language of these machines before she could even ride a bicycle. She moved past the agricultural monitoring systems. She slipped silently past the geothermal power grids. She found the restricted files. Locke had completely lied about his intentions. He did not want her biometric data to expand the hydroponic gardens. He did not want to share the deep earth heat with the starving people on the surface. She opened a heavily encrypted file, labeled Project Clean Sweep. Her stomach clamped tight. A cold sweat broke out along her spine. The file contained the chemical blueprints for a highly aggressive, airborne pathogen. It was a biological weapon. Locke had spent the last 8 years modifying old pre-war viruses, but he lacked the complex terraforming distribution codes stored inside the Eden drive. He needed her drive to load the virus into the massive atmospheric scrubbers on the surface. He planned to pump the toxic pathogen directly into the wind currents. It would sweep across the entire continent in a matter of weeks. It would kill absolutely everyone left alive on the surface. Locke wanted a completely empty world, a clean slate for his chosen few. Harper realized instantly that Silas was going to be executed. Locke had absolutely no use for him anymore. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. She typed with desperate, calculated speed. She did not try to hide her intrusion. She did not care about stealth anymore. She initiated a total system override. She targeted the primary security servers. She wrote a rapid command script to kill the power to the lower-level slave collars. She needed to buy Silas time. She hit the execute key. Down in the sweltering heat of the reactor room, Silas stopped pulling at the metal collar. 3 seconds left. The red light was a solid, burning beam. The high-pitched tone became a continuous scream in his ears. He closed his eyes. He thought about the cold snow. He thought about the quiet woods. The tone stopped abruptly. The heavy iron collar let out a loud mechanical click. The magnetic lock released completely. The heavy metal halves swung open and fell heavily to the dirty concrete floor. Silas opened his eyes. Before he could process what had just happened, every single bright halogen light in the massive cavern instantly shut off. The entire underground space plunged into total darkness. A second later, dark red emergency lights began to spin on the walls. A deafening mechanical siren began to wail from the ceiling speakers. The automated voice of the facility artificial intelligence began to broadcast on a continuous loop. Fire suppression systems activated on upper levels. Facility-wide lockdown initiated. Maeve looked at Silas in the dim red light. She showed her teeth in a wide, dangerous smile. "I do not know what you did," Maeve shouted over the blaring sirens, "but that is the distraction we needed." Silas did not hesitate. The darkness was his territory. This was exactly how he hunted in the ashfall. He dropped low to the ground and moved out from behind the steam pipe. The guard who had fired at them was standing in the open, confused by the sudden darkness and the blaring alarms. Silas approached him from the blind side. He moved completely silently on the balls of his feet. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He grabbed the barrel of the AR-15 and forced it aggressively toward the ceiling. He drove his right knee hard into the guard's stomach. As the man doubled over, Silas ripped the rifle out of his hands. Silas flipped the rifle completely around. He swung the heavy polymer stock like a club, striking the guard directly in the temple. The man collapsed in a heap. Silas checked the weapon. The fire selector switch was set to automatic. He clicked it back to single fire. Automatic fire was a complete waste of ammunition in a dark room. He needed precise, controlled shots. He checked the magazine. It felt heavy, fully loaded. He had 30 rounds of high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition. "Follow me," Silas commanded. He moved methodically through the maze of heavy machinery. He kept his back against the warm brick walls. He sliced the pie around every dark corner, leading with the muzzle of his stolen rifle. Maeve followed closely behind him, clutching a heavy iron wrench in her good hand. They moved toward the heavy steel grate at the back of the cavern. The red emergency lights cast long, chaotic shadows across the floor. Thick white steam vented violently from a ruptured pipe near the ceiling, creating a dense fog that hung low in the air. 2 heavily armored guards stood directly in front of the chain ventilation grate. They had their pump-action shotguns raised, scanning the red fog. They were nervous. The slave workers around them had realized the collars were dead. The crowd was beginning to close in, armed with hammers, heavy chains, and metal pipes. A violent riot was seconds away from erupting. Silas raised the rifle to his shoulder. He rested the plastic handguard on a rusted metal railing to stabilize his aim. He took a slow, deep breath. He let half of it out and held it. The red dot sight hovered perfectly over the chest plate of the guard on the left. He squeezed the trigger smoothly. The rifle barked sharply. He fired twice in rapid succession. A standard double tap. Both rounds hit the left guard precisely in the center of his chest, punching clean through the ceramic armor plating. The man dropped his shotgun and fell backward. The right guard panicked. He pumped his shotgun and fired a wild, blinding blast of buckshot into the steam. The heavy lead pellets shredded the brick wall 10 feet away from Silas. Silas shifted his aim slightly to the right. He fired 2 more precise shots. The second guard went down instantly, his armor utterly failing to stop the high-velocity rounds. Silas pushed forward out of the cover. He kept the rifle raised, scanning the area for any more threats. The floor was clear. The mob of angry workers rushed past them, swarming the remaining guards on the lower floor. The air filled with the sounds of screaming and crushing metal. The slave rebellion had officially begun. Maeve ran to the ventilation grate. She did not waste time with the heavy chains on the front. She reached through the steel bars with her bare hands. She grabbed the internal locking bolts that she had spent 6 months slowly cutting with a smuggled hacksaw blade. She pulled hard. The weakened metal bolts snapped cleanly off. She kicked the heavy steel grate. It swung outward on rusty hinges, revealing a dark, vertical shaft. A narrow metal ladder was bolted directly to the damp concrete wall. It disappeared straight up into the absolute blackness. "Go!" Maeve yelled. She pushed Silas toward the dark hole. "Climb. Do not stop until you hit the maintenance floor." Silas slung the rifle securely across his back. He grabbed the cold, rusted rungs of the ladder and began to pull himself upward into the narrow shaft. The air inside the vent smelled sharply of ozone and old dust. It was completely pitch black. He climbed purely by touch. His muscles burned with the intense physical exertion. He climbed for what felt like hours. He focused entirely on the repetitive motion. Left hand, right foot, right hand. Left foot. The heat of the reactor room slowly faded away beneath them. The air grew significantly cooler. The sounds of the violent riot became a faint, muffled echo deep below. Finally, his right hand hit a solid metal barrier. It was the upper vent cover. Silas braced his boots firmly against the ladder rungs. He pushed hard against the metal grate with both hands. It lifted slightly, but it was incredibly heavy. He pushed harder, ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulders. The grate scraped loudly against concrete and slid out of the way. Cool, perfectly conditioned air rushed over his face. He pulled himself up and out of the shaft. He rolled onto a clean, white tile floor. He unslung his rifle and brought it up to his shoulder immediately, ready to fire. He was in the main control center of the upper levels. The walls were lined with massive, blinking server racks. The red emergency lights bathed the room in a bloody hue. He froze. Sitting in a chair in the exact center of the room was Harper. Her hands were tied tightly behind her back with heavy plastic zip ties. Her face was bruised and bleeding from a fresh cut above her eye. Standing directly behind her was Garrison Locke. The immaculate gray suit was gone. He wore a black tactical vest over a dark shirt. He held a silver semi-automatic pistol. The cold steel barrel of the weapon was pressed firmly and directly against the side of Harper's head. Locke looked at Silas. The cold, dead eyes showed absolutely no fear. "Drop the rifle, scavenger," Locke said softly, "or I will paint this clean floor with her brains." Chapter 6. The Fall of Eden. Silas kept the black polymer stock of the rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. The red dot sight rested exactly on the bridge of Garrison Locke's nose. Locke held the silver pistol firm against Harper Temple. The red emergency lights washed over them in a slow, rhythmic pulse. The automated siren continued to blare heavily from the ceiling speakers. "I will not tell you again," Locke said. His voice was completely steady. He did not sweat. He did not shake. "Put the weapon on the floor." Silas calculated the distance instantly. 20 feet. The heavy bullet from his rifle would travel that distance in a fraction of a second. But a dying man reflex could still pull a trigger. He could not risk it. He slowly lowered the barrel of the AR-15 toward the white tile floor. A loud metallic clang echoed from the dark vent behind Silas. Maeve pulled herself up from the metal shaft. She saw the standoff immediately. She did not hesitate. She gripped the heavy iron wrench tight in her good hand. She threw it with all her physical strength across the room. The heavy metal tool spun through the air. It smashed violently into the glass screen of a massive server rack right next to Locke. The glass shattered outward in a brilliant, noisy explosion. Locke flinched. He pulled his head away and turned his weapon toward the sudden noise for a single second. That was all Silas needed. He snapped the rifle back up to his shoulder. He fired one shot. The .55 6mm round shattered Locke's right wrist. The silver pistol spun out of his hand and clattered across the floor tiles. Locke let out a sharp grunt of pain. He stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding arm. The heavy double doors at the far end of the control room suddenly blew open. 6 elite guards rushed into the room. They wore heavy black body armor and carried compact submachine guns. They saw Locke bleeding and immediately opened fire. "Get down," Silas roared. He dove aggressively behind a thick, metal command desk. Bullets tore through the air, completely shredding the computer monitors and drywall above his head. Plastic shrapnel and white dust rained down on his heavy wool coat. Maeve scrambled rapidly across the floor on her hands and knees. She grabbed Harper by the shoulders and pulled her down behind the heavy server racks. Silas leaned around the edge of the metal desk. He fired 3 precise shots. 2 guards dropped heavily to the floor. The remaining 4 fanned out fast, moving tactically behind the concrete support pillars. They were trying to flank his position. The sharp smell of burnt gunpowder quickly filled the cold air. "Harper," Silas yelled over the deafening gunfire. "Kill the system. Now." Harper sat with her back against the cold metal rack. Her hands were still bound tightly behind her with thick plastic zip ties. She rolled over onto her side. She found a jagged shard of thick glass from the broken server screen. She rubbed the thick plastic ties aggressively against the razor-sharp edge. It cut deep into her wrists, drawing warm blood, but she kept sawing frantically. The plastic finally snapped. Her hands were completely free. She ignored her bleeding wrists entirely. She crawled rapidly toward the primary central console. Bullets sparked against the floor tiles all around her. Silas laid down heavy cover fire, forcing the guards to keep their heads down behind the pillars. Harper reached the main terminal. She raised her mechanical left arm. The hidden panel slid open. She pulled the Eden drive out. She shoved the metal drive directly into the master port on the console. The large screen flashed a bright, warning red. "Master override accepted," the automated voice announced over the speakers. Harper typed furiously with her right hand. She did not initiate a simple shutdown. She initiated a complete destructive format. She targeted the terraforming data. She targeted the bioweapon research files. She targeted the primary life support codes and the security protocols. She was wiping the entire brain of the facility. "What are you doing?" Locke screamed loudly. He was leaning heavily against a far wall, holding his shattered wrist against his chest. Blood soaked the sleeve of his black shirt. His calm facade was completely gone. He looked like a wild, desperate animal. "You are destroying the future." "I am saving it," Harper said coldly. She hit the final execution key. A massive electronic hum vibrated deep through the floor. Every single screen in the control room instantly went black. The red emergency lights flickered violently and died. The automated sirens cut off abruptly. The massive underground facility went completely silent. "Data purge complete," the automated voice stated calmly in the dark. "Primary ventilation systems offline. Heavy blast doors initiating final seal." Harper stood up. She raised her heavy mechanical fist. She brought it down with devastating, brutal force directly onto the center of the glass keyboard. The console shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. The master terminal was entirely dead. Locke could never retrieve the data now. Locke let out a guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage. He grabbed a heavy steel combat knife from his tactical vest with his left hand. He lunged directly across the dark room toward Harper. He wanted to gut her right there. Silas stepped out from behind the command desk. He did not raise his rifle. The quarters were too tight for a long barrel. He let the weapon drop by its sling. He stepped directly into Locke's path. Locke swung the heavy combat knife towards Silas' throat in a desperate, vicious arc. Silas caught Locke's left wrist with his own left hand. He twisted the arm violently outward, breaking the joint with a loud pop. Locke gasped for air. Silas drove his right fist forward. He held his heavy steel hunting knife. The thick blade slid smoothly upward, directly under Locke's ribcage, piercing his heart. Locke stopped moving entirely. The intense anger slowly drained from his pale eyes, replaced by total, cold emptiness. Silas twisted the handle once and pulled the knife free. The dictator of the Eden Vault fell heavily to the floor. He was dead before he hit the broken tiles. The remaining 4 guards saw their leader fall. They looked around the dark, dying room. The air was already growing thin and stale. They dropped their submachine guns onto the floor and ran for the emergency exit stairs. They only cared about their own survival now. They had no one left to pay them. "We have to go," Maeve shouted urgently. "The blast doors are closing. We will suffocate in this tomb if we stay." Silas grabbed Harper by the arm. "Run." They sprinted blindly out of the control room. They hit the main white corridor. The facility was tearing itself apart. Deep underground, the angry workers had breached the armory. Explosions echoed heavily from the lower reactor levels. Thick black smoke began to fill the pristine, clean hallways. The smell of burning plastic and oil overpowered the scent of the hydroponic gardens. Silas, Harper, and Maeve joined a massive surge of dirty, starving workers rushing up the main access ramps. The heavy iron slave collars were entirely dead. The people were free, but they were running for their lives. They reached the primary entrance tunnel. The air was thick with gray dust and choking smoke. People were coughing and pushing forward in a blind panic. At the end of the long concrete corridor, the massive steel blast doors were slowly grinding shut. The gap between them was closing incredibly fast. 5 feet, 4 feet. "Do not stop," Silas roared at the crowd. He pushed a slow-moving older man forward, keeping the heavy crowd moving. Maeve slipped easily through the shrinking gap. Harper dove through the opening, rolling hard onto the frozen ground outside. Silas was the absolute last one in the dark tunnel. The gap was less than 2 feet wide. The massive hydraulic gears screamed in protest as they pushed the heavy steel plates together. Silas turned his right shoulder and threw himself horizontally through the opening. The thick fabric of his wool coat caught sharply on the jagged edge of the steel door. He pulled forward with all his remaining physical strength. The tough fabric ripped loudly. He hit the frozen dirt outside just as the 2 massive blast doors slammed completely shut behind him. The locking mechanisms engaged with a deafening, earth-shaking boom. The sound echoed massively across the entire mountain valley. The Vault of Eden was sealed forever. It was now a mass grave for the old world. Silas laid flat on his back in the dirt. He stared straight up at the sky. He took a long, deep breath. The air was bitterly cold. It burned his lungs. It smelled strongly of gray ash and dead pine trees. But it was completely clean. It was the absolute smell of freedom. He sat up slowly. His muscles ached deep in his bones. His hands were covered entirely in dried blood and black machine grease. He looked around the open space. Nearly 200 survivors stood together in the snow. They were shivering violently, exhausted, and wearing thin, dirty clothes. They looked back at the massive, silent rock face of the mountain. The golden cage was gone. The heat was gone. Maeve walked over to him. She wiped a thick layer of dark soot from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked at the shivering crowd, then she looked directly at Silas. "We have a lot of hungry mouths to feed," Maeve said quietly, "and winter is nowhere near over." "We will find a way," Harper said. She walked up and stood firmly beside them. She was holding her injured arm tight against her chest, but she stood incredibly tall. Her bright blue eyes scanned the gray, dead horizon. She was no longer a naive, sheltered girl from a bunker. She was a hardened survivor of the surface. Silas reached down and picked up his rifle from the cold snow. He checked the mechanical action, brushing the white powder carefully from the cold steel barrel. He looked at Harper, then at Maeve, and finally at the large group of people waiting quietly for some kind of direction. For 8 long years, he had walked this dead world entirely alone. He had trusted no one. He had cared for absolutely no one. That solitary life was over now. He had a small army of angry, desperate people. They had nothing but the ragged clothes on their backs. But they were alive, and they were willing to fight. The wind began to howl loudly through the dead trees. Fresh snowflakes began to fall heavily from the dark gray sky, covering the bloody tracks they had made. Silas slung his rifle securely over his shoulder. He raised his hand and pointed toward the southern valley. "There is an old abandoned lumber mill 10 miles south of here," Silas said. His voice carried strongly over the wind. "It has solid brick walls and a massive timber supply. We move right now before the storm hits us." He turned away from the mountain and began to walk straight into the gray wasteland. Harper smiled faintly. She stepped perfectly into his deep footprints in the snow. Maeve followed right behind her. The rest of the survivors began to march forward, forming a long, dark line moving steadily through the white storm. The world was still entirely dead, but they were not broken yet.